In this video, I'll go over the best practices as you proceed through the steps of developing the survey. When you start developing a survey, it's important that you start out by defining the constructs you're trying to measure. Sometimes people really superficially have this idea in their head of what they're trying to measure, and then they start writing items right away, and that's a bad idea. You want to start out by defining it, the constructs that you want to measure. And so what we're trying to do in this phase is we want to be very specific about the constructs you're trying to measure. So if you're measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, then what do you mean by diversity? Define it. What does an organization that's high on diversity look like? What does an organization that's low on diversity look like? What kinds of actions do they engage in? What kinds of actions do they not engage in? That sort of thing. And there's a good book that touches on this. This questionnaire research by Mildred L. Patton. It's Questionnaire Research, a Practical Guide. I would say this describes what you should do at the most basic level when you're defining the constructs you're trying to measure. I would say the next step up would be to follow the guidelines in Chapter 2 of this book, Constructing Measures, an Item Response Modeling Approach. You can just look at Chapter 2 for this purpose, and it's pretty accessible. And so the goal is to have a very clear foundation of the constructs you're trying to measure, so that when you move into the next phase where you're writing the items, you can identify the constructs that each item is trying to measure, and that you can write those items to those constructs without drifting away and asking questions that are not relevant to the constructs you're trying to measure. And the next step would be to write items. And here are some general rules of thumb. So you'll want to start out with about 90 to 120 items. And if you haven't already engaged content experts in the previous step where you're defining the constructs you're trying to measure, this is a good time to do that. Get about 3 to 5 content experts, people who are experts in the constructs you're trying to measure. So again, if you're trying to create a survey that's measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations, then having experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion help you write these items. And use no more than 1 to 3 response scales. So one response scale might be something like, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Try to use that as much as you can, and maybe have another one that talks about frequency. So like almost never to almost always. The goal is you don't want to be using too many of these response scales, because that adds to the cognitive load of the people responding, and that just sort of muddies the water and increases how much they have to think as they're responding to your questions, and you don't want that. Also, make sure that each question maps onto one specific construct. So if you have a question, it's in a diversity, equity, and inclusion survey, then that one question should measure diversity or equity or inclusion, and not try to measure more than one of those constructs. And the goal here is that you're developing this large item pool with the hope that when you further refine and make revisions, that the items that make it in the end are the best of the best. And in the next step, you'll want to review and revise those 90 to 120 items that you wrote. And you can use those same content experts and swap these items so that each content expert is looking at a different set of items that they did not write. And each content expert can judge each question against best practice guidelines. There are several that are written in this book that I referenced earlier. There are also other guidelines that exist out on the internet and you can find. There are things like avoiding writing double-barrel questions, and ultimately, you want to take all these questions, compare them to these best practices, and start modifying or eliminating questions with the goal of eliminating or reducing what I call this cloud of error. So when a person reads a question, when a respondent reads a question, they have to do several things. They have to read it, they have to interpret your question, they have to retrieve the response, and then they have to pick the right choice in the case of like multiple choice, or give you their accurate response. And depending on how the questions are written, if they're violating these best practices, what the accurate response that you were looking for doesn't line up with the response they put in. And that's what I'm referring to as this cloud of error. So this step is really designed to try to minimize that and get the accurate answer to the question that you are asking. Now, the fourth step is this think alouds, and this is a step that I see a lot of people skip, but I highly recommend that you do it. So I mentioned before this idea of cloud of error. Effectively, what you want to do, so we don't see that, right? We kind of talk amongst ourselves when we're developing a survey. We have these content experts, we're writing all these questions. We've been looking at these questions over and over again, so to us they make complete sense. We understand that, but that's not necessarily the case for a respondent, somebody who will look at those questions for the first time and then start trying to answer them. And this exercise tries to look into their thoughts, how they're interpreting and understanding your questions. And so what you will do in this step is to gather 4 to 6 people that are like the respondents that will ultimately complete your survey. You'll want to turn on a video recorder, have them read these questions out loud, have them talk out loud, talk through their thought process. And the goal of this step is really to understand how they understand your question, and have them answer also. But you don't care about the answer. You just want to make sure that each of the questions are understood in the way that you intended them to be understood, and that they everybody has an opportunity to respond accurately in a way that reflects their actual thoughts. And again, the goal of this exercise is to eliminate or reduce that cloud of error. So this really puts a spotlight on their thought process to allow you to further reduce. So you have the previous step where you use these best practice guidelines for item writing, and that's great. But now you get to actually hear what people think, something that you can't do when you are just giving them a survey, giving out a survey to a few hundred people. So in this fifth step, you're going to be piloting the survey. And in this step, you're really wanting to test the entire process. And a good rule of thumb is to have about 10 to 15 respondents for each item on your survey, or each question. And you want to learn what is and isn't working. So from the whether the emails get through the spam filters for the organization that's going to be receiving the survey, to the invitations, the language that you're using for the invitations, the language that you're using for the reminder emails, looking to see how many people respond and if you need to boost that in subsequent survey administrations. But then also you're going to be gathering the data from all of these responses, and you'll be able to do item analyses to be able to now look at the data to tell you about the quality of the questions that you have in your survey, to look at the reliability of the survey, and as an indication of whether or not you're measuring what you set out to measure. Now, when you're all said and done and you have this survey and you've gone through this entire process and you're pretty confident that it's doing what you want it to do, you should have something that looks somewhat like this. Now, these are just rules of thumb because it'll depend on the survey that you're using, the population you're administering it to, and a variety of other factors. But you want a short survey. I mean, I've been using the word survey because most of my clients use the word survey, but what I have specified here is the questionnaire, the actual set of questions themselves. I've been using that interchangeably with survey. And so you'll want it to be short. 10 minutes is a nice rule of thumb. You'll want it to have 25 or fewer core questions, core items. And what I mean by core items is that these are the items that actually measure the constructs you care about. So again, going back to the diversity, equity, and inclusion survey example, you'd want 25 items that measure those 3 constructs, or less, 25 or less items. And in general, you'll want about 4 to 6 items per construct. So again, diversity, equity, and inclusion, either 4 to 6 items for diversity, 4 to 6 items for equity, 4 to 6 items for inclusion, for example. And then you might have a set of additional items that you have, like questions that are asking about race, ethnicity, gender, that sort of thing. But again, I would think about not having those questions, and instead, if you have a list of respondents that will be receiving the email, like if you're going and administering this survey to organizations and you have the email list, then ask for the demographic information of those respondents, and then you can just upload that along with your email list. And then all you have to do is ask the respondents to fill out the core items. And then you can save them the time of not responding about their ethnicity, tenure at the organization, the department they work for, and that sort of thing. If you're worried about confidentiality, or that sense of confidentiality, you can just put a disclaimer at the beginning of the questionnaire that says, look, The client, your organization will not see any of your identifiable information. They will not see your individual response. This will all be kept confidential. And while you're sort of going through your normal practice of administering the questionnaire, of course, you're going to be collecting more and more data, and that data will be useful because you'll be able to use that to monitor the quality of your questionnaire, as well as gather evidence, more evidence about the reliability of your questionnaire and the validity of your questionnaire. So are these scores on diversity, equity, and inclusion and changes in diversity, equity, and inclusion within an organization correlated with their performance or with the retention of employees, that sort of thing? I hope this video was helpful. If you have a survey that you've developed and you want help examining the reliability and or validity of that survey, just visit www.parsimonyinc.com and schedule a call.